Hey guys, what is up? Pellic back with another video, and today is going to be kind of an appended section to all the guides that I just released earlier, last couple weeks or so. There was a mastery bug inside of SimC that I've since fixed. So it's unfortunate this bug happened, but the best we can do is move on from it, see what happens. So the TLDR of what happened is that Mind Blast and Shadow of Death were not getting their appropriate modifiers for mastery, which has led to several things, mainly being that the Sims were undervaluing mastery and any of those modifiers that kind of come after that, right? So this has changed up a few things specifically. Now, in the grand scheme of things, the biggest thing that was wrong is your sim DPS was a little bit lower than it should, and the actual legendary recommendations were a bit off, and some of the actual covenant balancing is a bit closer together than we originally thought. So in the grand scheme, it's not really going to change a whole lot of what we were doing or things like that. In fact, I still stick by most of my advice, but there are some specific things that I do want to add to all the previous guides that I've written and done videos for, because there's some important information I want to make sure that you guys all have to make the best decision for your priest going forward inside of the Shadowlands. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so bug aside, kind of giving a brief overview of what this video is going to do, I'm actually just going to go down the line of everything that I've covered in both my written and video guides and kind of tell you what has changed and what kind of the differences are now. I will say before I get started, the Icy Veins guide is almost all up to date. There probably are some nuances that I'll keep adding as we go on, but for the most part, things are up to date there. So if you want to check out the written version, you can check that out. But all the video versions that I've already released are, again, for the most part, 90-95% of that content is still going to stay the same. There's just a couple things in each of the videos that we want to correct to make sure you guys have the right updates for. So let's start off with stats. This is one of the first things that I covered. For the most part, the advice that I was giving before was that, you're going after item level, and then after that, you want to get haste. This is still 100% true. In fact, if that's how you geared your character, you're probably still fine. What has changed, though, is after that. So because of the problem with mastery, it was under-simming. The Sims are basically pointing that haste and mastery are more or less equal, if anything leaning towards haste in this equation. However, depending on your legendary choice, if you decide to go with Talbodar's Stratagem as your legendary, which we'll get into in just a second, that legendary does have effects on this and starts making haste and mastery equal. If anything, leaning towards mastery a bit more, considering, a lot of us, including myself, once you start getting, mythic pieces, you're going to start getting to up in that 30% haste territory, and you're going to want to start dumping your stats somewhere else. That's probably going to be mastery. So what this means in terms of your gearing progression, if you're doing rating and you care about optimizing for rating, I would say you want to basically put haste and mastery equal to each other. After that, you want to get crit and then get versatility. Those are kind of your order of stats. Eye level is still king here. Don't worry about that. Now, if you are rating and you're still using Eternal Call to the Void as your rated legendary, which is still a fine choice, haste is still probably going to overtake mastery in that case. And then definitely will overtake that in a case where we start getting to Mythic Plus environments when you're looking at overall DPS. So for that reason, I'm going to suggest you guys, for the most part, look for haste mastery pieces instead of the haste crit ones that you were looking for before. Critical Strike is still a good stat to have. It's not like it got worse. It's just, when we're talking about relative differences with stats, ideally we're starting to get more haste mastery pieces rather than haste crit. If a piece does not have haste on it but is like a mastery crit piece, it's going to be okay. Just know that you're probably going to want to make up for that haste somewhere else, whether it's with your enchants, your gems, something else like that. Haste is still something we want on almost every piece of gear if we can help it. Now again, a lot of you guys were probably crafting your legendaries with haste and crit. And I've gotten a lot of questions on, hey, should I recraft that legendary? Unfortunately, while you're upgrading legendary, you cannot change the stats on it right now. It's something we asked for in beta, but never got. Maybe that comes in a future patch for the game, but right now you cannot change the stats on a legendary. So my advice for a lot of you guys, if you've already crafted your Eternal Call to the Void at crit haste, I don't think there's really a big reason to craft a second one with haste mastery. It'll get you a little bit better results on pure single target, but I think generally speaking that crit is something that's not a bad thing to have either. Is it really worth the soul ash? Probably not. I would keep on to that. Now, for any new legendaries that you're crafting, whether it's Talbodar's Twins, anything else that you're using for your Shadow Priest, I would suggest going haste mastery for the stats on that legendary. If you only have like a rank 1, rank 2 twins or Talbodar's legendary, it might be worth to kind of restart the crafting process with the right stats. but I'll leave that up to you. The difference in there is very, very tiny. The legendary item sims are going to be pinned in the description if you want to check out, like, hey, if I was using a haste mastery Talbotars versus haste crit, what's the difference in that? You're going to find the difference is actually pretty minimal, but maybe that's something you want to care about and optimize. Okay, guys, so that's the kind of TLDR for stats. Again, please check out the guides and the posts in the description if you want a bit more detail on that stuff. All right, guys, let's talk about legendary powers. I already kind of mentioned this in the stats, but with these changes, it is clear that Talbotar Stratagem is a very competitive legendary for most raiding environments. So I think, generally speaking, looking at the Sims is hard to really get a good value out of this legendary because it is a little bit different than what we're used to with Eternal Call to the Void. And I think actually for most Shadow Priests, especially if you're in this kind of mythic raiding tier, you probably care about 3 legendaries specifically that you probably want to have in your back pocket for raiding, which is Eternal Call to the Void, Talbotar Stratagem, and Twins of the Sun Priestess. Now, with these 3 legendaries, they all do something very, very distinct. Let's start with the DPS ones, Eternal Call to the Void and Talbotar Stratagem. I think Talbotar's is a fine default to have. However, you want to be a little careful here because, it has no protection on it, right? It is just a flat damage amp to Mind Blast, meaning if you're having to handle mechanics or do target swapping or something is impacting your ability to keep devouring plague up on the target, this damage of this legendary will suffer because of that. On the other hand, the Eternal Call to the Void legendary is going to be, it's an inconsistent legendary. It's a proc-based legendary. All you have to do is cast Mind Flay to proc it. You don't necessarily get more procs by casting more Mind Flays. That's how RPPM should work. And because of that, it is inherently easier to use, and it has some built-in kind of protection or forgiveness aspect with it, right? Because if you're out, I'm handling a mechanic or maybe the boss is in intermission phase, whatever it is, you're not wasting any damage or wasting any procs. In fact, because you haven't procced it in a while, once the boss comes back out of that phase or once you're done handling that mechanic, your likeliness of getting a proc on your actual DPS uptime on the boss goes up. So because of that, on fights with heavy intermissions, Eternal Call to the Void is going to be still a very competitive legendary and still a great legendary for progression. Now, if you're playing well, playing to the best of your ability, you're going to see great results out of Talbotars, especially on those very early bosses that are mostly single target. You're going to get a lot of value out of them. But once you get into fights like, Generals or Denathrius or other fights that have kind of a lot of things happening, a lot of mechanics to handle, Eternal Call to the Void is probably going to be the better choice there. Same thing with something like your Blood Council fights, things like that. Now, that being said, with those 2 legendaries, again, you probably already have Eternal Call to the Void. I would suggest crafting Talbotars with a Haste Mastery stat on them. Which slot you craft it on doesn't really matter. They're very close together if you want to check out the Sims in the description. But I still think it's probably good to have those in your back pocket. If you're doing a parse raid, whatever it is, from a progression standpoint, using on some of those single target bosses is going to be a great choice for you. In my Castle Nathria written guide, I've kind of gone over which of those make sense where and when I would choose which one. But again, guys, it's going to come down to, do you want Talbotars that has consistent damage, but it's not very forgiving? Or do you want Eternal Call to the Void that has inconsistent damage, but can be very forgiving if you're handling mechanics? And if you get really lucky with procs, Eternal Call to the Void can crush Talbotars. So, you can take that risk as well. Now, that being said, Twins of the Sun Priestess is pretty much going to be your go-to legendary for early mythic progression, especially on any and all bosses that have hard DPS requirements. So specifically thinking about bosses like Sludge Fist or things like that, getting twins on or power infusion on another DPS is almost always going to be a better choice for that damage than, say a damage legendary that only affects the Shadow Priest. This is purely just because the value of giving someone else power infusion is very, very strong, especially if, they're playing their class to their fullest ability, whatever else it is. And if it's helping you get the damage when you want it for the raid rather than just for yourself, that can be something to really help you kind of speed your progression up faster than usual. So I don't think these mastery changes really change up that aspect of using twins. Talbotars is for what it is, it's about 1% better than Eternal Call to the Void, right? Which isn't a whole lot of damage. That's really all it comes down to. But twins is still going to be a great choice nonetheless. All right, let's move on to the other things that covers legendaries. All right, next 2 seconds are going to be kind of quick here. The first thing I want to cover is rotation. So, does this bug fix change up our rotation? The answer is really not much. The two things I do want to call out that I did make, some changes to our build and what we were doing. The first one is Devouring Plague in multi-target situations. For the most part, this was something that I was advising people to do anyway, but the Sims have now kind of solidified that as the definite path to do, which is if you're fighting more than one target, specifically 2 or 3 targets, and you're like, okay, what do I do with my Devouring Plagues here? Do I spread them or dump them on a single target? This has always been a case of if you're using Hungering Void, you definitely want to tunnel, but outside of that, the answer is kind of fuzzy. Now, with this mastery change, it is very definite you want to have that funnel target, regardless of Hungering Void or not, regardless of Talbotars or not, because of casting things like Void Bolt, Mind Blast, and Mind Flay into a target with full mastery benefit is always going to be something that you want to do. Now, if you are flooded with Insanity, that could be a case where you can still spread them, but generally speaking, I have not seen that definitively ever be a thing inside of Sims, so I would definitely suggest you want to have that kind of funnel priority target. Now, the only real place this really comes into mind is Huntsman, where you could choose to have 2 Devouring Plagues out or just funnel in that one target. In this case, you want to funnel in that one target. Just keep in mind the same rules that we always have with don't cap on your Insanity and make sure you're refreshing as close to the last second as possible. The other thing that has changed is a very small change that makes some sense with what we saw with the bug, is using Mind Blast earlier on in your opener. If you noticed in that kind of rotation video I did, I mentioned don't worry about using that Mind Blast before Void Form. We want to add that back in now, so after you're dumping that Void Torrent, before you're going into your first Void Form, you get a reset on that Mind Blast cooldown. Using that before you go into Void Form is turned out to be a better increase on 1 or 2 targets specifically. Especially if you're, getting flooded with Insanity, you cast that Devouring Plague, and then you can get a Talbotar's increased Mind Blast before you go into your Void Form, because we are a little bit GCD locked in Void Form, and delaying that Mind Blast for other things does make sense, but getting that extra one before we go into Void Form is a good thing to do. Other than that, there are no other rotational changes I want to bring to light right now. With Talbotar specifically, you're going to get tempted to play differently with it. I assure you, playing the way you have been is going to be the better thing to do. You do not want to reserve Mind Blast for only casting it when you have all 3 dots up with Talbotars. That's generally speaking going to net you a loss more than anything. Just because, Mind Blast is basically the conduit for getting more Devouring Plagues out. So delaying that is just going to cause some friction. You don't want to do that. The only time that you would ever do that kind of delay is like a natural delay that you would have already done, saying like, hey, I have 50 Insanity to spend on a Devouring Plague. It's not currently active. Should I use Mind Blast first or Devouring Plague first? Well, you should use Devouring Plague first, right? That's just common sense. I'm sure a lot of you are already doing that. But if you're like, hey, I only have 10 or 15 Insanity, but Mind Blast is available, should I hold it for Devouring Plague in 5-6 seconds? The answer is no, right? You should for sure cast that Mind Blast. You'll get more lineups overall with that, just because of getting that increased Devouring Plague uptime is very, very important. Okay, guys, the next thing we'll talk about in this little section is talent choices. So the mastery bug, for the most part, has not done much to our talents. It, for the most part, did solidify Fortress of the Mind as a clear winner of our talents here, which makes sense. Death and Madness had similar increases as well for Mythic Plus, which, again, we all expected. The one thing I do want to call out here is Psychic Link. So generally speaking, I still don't think you should use Psychic Link for a lot of things, but there are cases with Talbotar specifically where that can be competitive in certain environments. And that's specifically in spread multi-target cleave when you do not care about single target, which is very, very important. So on a fight like Huntsman, when you basically have 2 targets out for, let's say 80%, 90% of the fight, this is actually a very good talent to take. It can give you amazing damage increases, especially with Talbotars on that fight. The problem is, once you get to the last phase of Huntsman, when it's just the boss up, the ad is dead, well, Psychic Link provides you a big fat 0 DPS increase, which is basically killing the talent and anything else that might make it viable. Like, for example, Sire Genathrius, phase 2 would be great with Psychic Link, but the first and last phase would be terrible for it. So taking a talent that only works in one phase is usually not a great recommendation to do. It's not going to pull that far ahead usually to make it worth it in those cases. Now, for that same reason, Psychic Link and Mythic Plus with like a Talbotar's Misery build, not something you want to consider in my opinion. One, Shadow Crash is just far too good. And even on dungeons like Theater of Pain where we are running Misery, losing out on Shadow Crash is just, it's a hard thing to lose, frankly. And I think Eternal Call to the Void or Twins of the Sun Priestess would still make more sense there. On other dungeons where we use Searing Nightmare, Psychic Link just is going to take a lot to compete with Searing Nightmare, frankly, especially considering they're kind of 2 competing playstyles. so not something I would suggest for most folks doing dungeons right now. That being said, we're still going to tune the APL, so I'll give you an update if anything changes on like a Psychic Link dungeon build, but right now, not looking good for that. Okay, let's move on to Conduits and Covenants. All right, guys, let's talk about Conduits and Covenants. Conduits are the easy one here. There's really nothing to change. I know a lot of you guys were asking questions about Mind Devourer specifically with this change and if it makes sense. As far as I can tell, while it did get slightly better, it's still not going to beat out our second best conduit, which is Haunting Apparitions, and is still like a third or a fourth as good as Dissonant Echoes for the most part. So as of right now, even if you're using Talbotars, using Mind Devourer, it does not make sense. Just frankly, the numbers just don't work out for it. This could be something that might change if you're doing some crazy Psychic Link builds or whatever. But from my testing, even if you're using Psychic Link, you'd be better off using Haunting Apparitions instead. It's just how the numbers work out. Nothing crazy. The proc is, not happening often enough to even impact into our gameplay. And the Mind Blast damage increase just frankly is just smaller than the Apparitions damage. So we're still running sims on Conduits and stuff, but please check the description by the time this is uploaded. Those will be fully released. But the early stuff is still saying not even close in terms of that, even if you're using Talbotars, so keep that in mind. Now, Covenants did receive a few changes. For the most part, everything has kind of stayed the same. The question is, though, if we factor in Talbotars, what's changing with these Covenants? Now, you might still use Eternal Call to the Void for some stuff, or whatever else it is. I have changed our sims to, on the composite sims, we're going to be using Talbotars on those guys. And then swap to Eternal Call to the Void for the dungeon sims to see how that would change up some of the rankings. For the most part, you're not really seeing a big change here for a lot of things. The biggest thing that we're going to see is Night Phase viability coming through much better and more clear inside of sims. We've already seen some great parses from people that are Night Fae inside of Castle Nathria. We're able to recreate a lot of what we were seeing there now. The logs are matching much more closely to the sim, which we'd expect. But with Night Fae, you're getting effectively more Void Form uptime, which means more Mind Blast uptime. And with Talbotars, that's a great thing. You're definitely seeing Night Fae as a competitive raid covenant for sure. Is it like overtaking everything or dumpstering all the other covenants? Not at all. In fact, Necrolord is still our, I would say, most competitive covenant in terms of like a raid simming perspective or a pure single target perspective. So, but that being said, Night Fae is still a great covenant choice for Shadow Priest. The thing you got to keep in mind though is it's going to be very variable based on that fight time, right? If the fight time doesn't allow for you to get an extra Void Form with Night Fae, or maybe, just one versus more than that, that's when you're going to start seeing the differences kind of start coming together with the other covenants. That being said, with the Grove Invigoration Soulbind for the Night Fae, getting that big chunk of mastery is very, very strong. So all of those are kind of contributing to Night Fae being a competitive covenant. So if you were ever, scared or was kind of unsure about going Night Fae, but that's something you want to do, by all means, you can make it work. It's just going to be a little different because CDR is a bit funny to play with, so keep that in mind. Same thing for Mythic Plus. It can still be a great Mythic Plus covenant. In fact, in my opinion, could be one of the best Mythic Plus covenants. It's just Sim Mythic Plus is a challenge, straight up. Dungeon Slice does an okay-ish job for like a starting sim, but that's all it is. It's just one tool. It's not going to be end-all be-all by any means. There's lots of work to be done on that front, but I still think, and a lot of Shadow Priests would agree with me, Night Fae can be great for dungeons if that's what you want to focus on. Now, let's talk about Necrolord real quick. For the most part, the sims are still showing it to be one of, if not the strongest PvE choice from an overall perspective. The only thing that's still kind of plaguing this covenant in my mind is that Unholy Nova's square root scaling can be annoying at times, but for the most part, you can play around with that, which is why I think you clearly see most Shadow Priests are picking Necrolord. If their primary focus is PvE on their Shadow Priests, makes perfect sense. Now, for those of you that have chosen Kyrian, Kyrian's still looking very, very strong, especially in single target with Pelagos. The problem just kind of stems from, Boon, the way Boon of the Ascended currently works when we're using it inside of Void Form. It is, for the most part, costing you Mind Blast casts. This is something we're actively working on seeing if we can tune the APL around that. But you definitely saw that Kyrian did not get as big of an increase from using Talbotars as the other three covenants. But that being said, Pelagos and Combat Meditation are still very, very strong for priests. They're still a very, very good and competitive covenant for sure. Dungeons is going to be kind of the wild card for Kyrian for sure, just because of Boon's value on AoE is kind of a bit wonky. It is a 3-minute cooldown, so it does need to be kind of beefy. But for the most part, I think a lot of Kyrian folks love having that in dungeons for things like Prideful and bosses. Great priority target damage. You just only get it every 3 minutes, which can be something if that's what you're looking for. And then last but certainly not least is Venthyr. Unfortunately, Venthyr, is generally speaking the lowest covenant consistently. But that's all it really does. It's not like it has a clear, oh, I'm the best at single target or AoE, whatever else it is. It's just trying to be an okay covenant across the board. It is brokenly overpowered in PvP, which if that's something you want to do, great. And it is great if you like to off-spec as well. All 3 soulbinds have their use. They're just not exceptional. The other 3 covenants have certain soulbind abilities that are just frankly amazing. Venthyr does not have that, for better or for worse, but that is what it is. Now, you can still get 99 parses as Venthyr, right? You can still do great raid DPS as a Venthyr Shadow Priest. Don't get me wrong. I'm doing it right now. It's just that, certainly the way that the ability works can provide some benefits, but it's clear from a sim and a numbers perspective that it is lagging behind the other ones right now, unfortunately. Again, you can make it work. I personally do like having an ability every 45 seconds that I can use to my advantage on a priority target. And I also like being able to PvP with it. I like it in the open world, and I like it when I play Discipline Priest for my raid. But if I was a dedicated Shadow Priest, I would consider going something else. It's just hard to make it work in everything that I want to do personally. But by all means, it's still very competitive if that's what you want. The differences we're talking about here are, again, 1% or so. And if that's not a big deal to you, I wouldn't worry about it. You can make it work for sure. All right, guys. That is it for this video. I know it's been kind of a long ride, and again, I'll apologize for the work that I played and any misleading that I've done, but I think you are all very set up to do great things going out from this video. So if you have any other questions, feel free to leave a comment on this. Message me out on Discord. I'll be happy to answer any and all questions and comments that you guys have. Look forward. I know things have been kind of wonky with the video schedule. I'm going to try and get videos out about dungeons and log reviews. It's just all this work has significantly delayed all that stuff that I wanted to work on. So please, thanks for bearing with me. Big thanks to the patrons that are kind of supporting me through this monstrosity of an event. I'm dedicating way too much amounts of free time getting everything working. And my fingers are hurting from all this coding I've had to done. But, that's what it is. That's what I'm here for, and I love doing it. So thank you so much for watching. Thanks for sticking with me, and thanks for your trust going forward. All right, guys. Have a good one. We'll see you in the next video.